I told my son I was broke on a Tuesday morning, and the look on his face told me everything I needed to know. My name is Walter Hayes, and I am 74 years old. For 40 years, I had worked quietly, saved carefully, and built a life that my family believed was much smaller than it really was. My son Michael had always asked about my house, my savings, and what would happen when I was gone. I had noticed it for years, but I kept making excuses for him because he was my son. That morning, I finally decided to test him. I called Michael and told him that I had lost most of my savings and could no longer afford to keep the house. I said I might have to sell it and move into a small apartment. There was silence on the phone. Then Michael said something I never expected. Finally, "I have been waiting for this." My heart sank. I asked him what he meant, but he quickly changed his tone and said he was only worried about me. I pretended to believe him, but inside, something had broken. Before I continue, tell me in the comments where you are watching this story from. That evening, Michael came to my house and acted unusually interested in the property. He walked through every room, asked how much I thought the house was worth, and even asked whether I had already spoken to a real estate agent. I told him I had not. He smiled and said he could help me find a buyer. I thanked him, but I was watching every word he said. He did not seem worried about where I would live. He seemed worried about how quickly he could get the house. The next morning, I woke up early and heard Michael talking on the phone downstairs. I quietly walked toward the staircase and stopped when I heard him mention a price. Then he said something that made me freeze. "Once my father signs the papers, the house is ours." I stood halfway down the stairs, listening to my son talk about my house as if I were already gone. He told the person on the phone that he could probably sell it for much more than the price he had mentioned to me. Then he said, "My father trusts me. He will sign whatever I put in front of him." I felt my chest tighten. I had spent years believing Michael might simply be careless with money, but now I was hearing something far worse. He was already planning what to do with my home before I had even agreed to sell it. I quietly returned to my bedroom and closed the door. Before I continue, tell me in the comments where you are watching this story from. A few minutes later, Michael knocked and asked if I was awake. I pretended I had just gotten out of bed. He came inside with coffee and started talking about how difficult things were for him financially. He said selling my house could solve problems for both of us. I asked him how he planned to help me after the sale. He looked away and said he would find me a small apartment. Then he asked if I had any other savings. I told him there was nothing left. His face changed for just a second, and I knew he did not believe me. He began asking questions about my bank accounts and whether I had any investments. I kept my answers simple and repeated that I was broke. Michael eventually left, but before closing the door, he said, "Dad, you should trust me. I am only trying to protect you." After he left, I opened the safe hidden behind a painting in my study. Inside were documents and financial records that proved I was not broke at all. I had enough money to live comfortably for the rest of my life. But I had wanted to know one thing. Would my son still love me if he believed I had nothing? Now I was beginning to realize that I had already received my answer. I closed the safe and sat at my desk for a long time, thinking about everything I had just heard. I did not want to believe that my own son could see my home as something he could simply take once he thought I was weak. But I had learned long ago that actions speak louder than promises. That afternoon, I called my longtime financial advisor, Robert Miller, and asked him to prepare a complete report of everything I owned. He was surprised by my request because he knew I had never needed to worry about money. I told him I wanted every account, investment, property, and business interest documented in one place. Then I asked him one more thing. I wanted to know if anyone had recently searched for information about my finances. The next morning, Robert called me with an answer that made my stomach turn. Someone had requested information about my estate through a legal office. The request had been made using my son's name. Michael had apparently told the office that I was becoming unable to manage my own affairs, and that he needed information to help protect my assets. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was creating a story that I was too old and confused to control my own property. I decided not to confront him yet. Instead, I wanted to see how far he would go. That evening, Michael arrived with a folder. He told me he had found a buyer who could purchase the house quickly. I opened the folder and saw a stack of documents already prepared for my signature. He had even arranged for someone to come the following morning to discuss the sale. I looked at my son and asked, "Michael, why are you in such a hurry?" He smiled and said, "Dad, you need the money." I nodded slowly and pretended to agree. But inside, I had made my decision. I was going to let him believe I was ready to sign. because the next step would reveal exactly what he had planned to do with my house. The next morning, a man named Mr. Collins arrived at my house with a briefcase and a stack of papers. Michael introduced him as the person who could handle the sale of my home. I welcomed him inside and acted confused about the documents. Exactly as my son expected, Mr. Collins explained that I only needed to sign a few papers and everything would be taken care of. I looked at the first page and noticed something strange. The document was not simply a house sale agreement. It gave Michael authority to handle several financial matters on my behalf. I looked at my son and asked why that was necessary if I was only selling my house. Michael quickly said, "Dad, it is just easier this way. You do not need to worry about all the paperwork." I pretended to be tired and told them I needed time to read everything. Michael became impatient. He told me that the buyer was ready and that waiting could make me lose the deal. That was when I knew this was never really about helping me sell my house. Michael wanted control. I told him I would sign the papers the next day. He reluctantly agreed and left with Mr. Collins. As soon as they were gone, I called Robert Miller and asked him to investigate the legal office that had prepared the documents. A few hours later, Robert called me back. He had discovered something that made my hands go cold. The buyer listed on the paperwork was not an ordinary homeowner. It was a company connected to a real estate investment group, and Michael was listed as one of the people expected to benefit from the transaction. I stared at the document in disbelief. My son was not planning to help me find a smaller home. He was planning to make money from selling mine. But Robert was not finished. He told me there was another document attached to the file, and this one was even more disturbing. It was a power of attorney that would give Michael control over my finances if I signed it. I looked at the signature line and whispered, "He wants me to sign away my entire life." I decided I would not confront Michael yet. If I accused him too soon, he could destroy the evidence and change his story. Instead, I called Robert again and asked him to help me set a trap. We prepared a new set of documents that looked like I was transferring control of my house and finances to Michael. But there was one important difference. The documents were completely harmless and could not give him any real authority. I wanted to see what he would do when he believed he had finally won. That evening, Michael came back to my house. He was smiling in a way I had not seen in years. He asked if I had thought about the papers. I told him I was ready to sign them the next morning. His smile became even wider. He said, "Dad, you are making the right decision. I promise you will never regret trusting me." I almost laughed. He had no idea I was testing him. The next day, Michael arrived with Mr. Collins and another man I had never met. They placed the documents in front of me and encouraged me to sign quickly. I pretended to struggle with the paperwork and asked Michael to explain what would happen after I signed. He said I would move into a small apartment while he handled the house. Then the stranger said something that made my blood run cold. "Once the transfer is complete, the property can be sold within days." Michael immediately looked at him and said, "Not sold. We already have someone interested." That confirmed everything. The house had already been promised to someone before I had even signed anything. I quietly looked at the hidden camera Robert had helped me install in the room. Everything was being recorded. Then I asked Michael one simple question. "Son, if I am broke and this house is all I have, why are you so excited about taking it?" His face suddenly changed. Michael stared at me for several seconds, and for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. Then he laughed nervously and said, "Dad, what are you talking about? I am excited because I am trying to help you." I looked at Mr. Collins, who suddenly stopped smiling. I told them I had one more question. If the house was worth so much, why had they prepared documents giving Michael control over my other finances too? Michael immediately became defensive and said I was confused because of my age. That sentence hurt more than anything else he had done. My own son was now using my age against me. I calmly told him that I was not confused at all. I knew exactly what I was reading. Then I stood up and told everyone to leave my house. Michael tried to argue, but I pointed toward the door and said, "You wanted me to believe I was helpless. Now you can leave and let me handle my own life." After they left, I called Robert and told him everything. He said the recording was extremely important because Michael had admitted that the property already had a potential buyer. We reviewed the footage and discovered even more conversations that had been recorded before the meeting. Michael had discussed the house with the real estate company and had already calculated how much money he expected to receive. He had also talked about putting me into a small apartment and using the rest of the sale money for himself. But there was something else in the recordings that shocked me. Michael had told someone that he believed I would not live much longer anyway. Hearing my own son speak about me that way broke something inside me. I had spent years defending him and making excuses for his mistakes. Now I finally understood that he had not been waiting for me to get better. He had been waiting for me to disappear. I spent that night sitting alone in my study, listening to the recording again and again. The words my son had spoken kept echoing in my mind. He had been waiting for me to die so he could take control of everything I had built. I wanted to confront him immediately, but Robert convinced me to wait. He told me that if we moved carefully, we could protect my assets and expose exactly what Michael had planned. The following morning, Robert contacted an attorney who specialized in financial exploitation of elderly people. I gave the attorney copies of the recordings, the property documents, the messages from Michael, and the paperwork prepared by Mr. Collins. After reviewing everything, the attorney told me something that gave me hope. Walter, your son may have believed you were helpless, but legally, you still have complete control over your property. We immediately placed additional protections on my accounts and notified the bank that no changes were to be made without my direct approval. Then we discovered something even more serious. Michael had already contacted another company about selling the house. He had given them information about my property and told them that I was willing to sell quickly. The attorney said this could prove that the plan had been organized before I ever told Michael I was broke. I decided to confront him, but not at home. I asked him to meet me at a quiet restaurant. When he arrived, he looked confident, as if he believed everything was still under his control. I told him that I had changed my mind and would not sell the house. His expression immediately hardened. He asked why. I looked directly into his eyes and said, "Because I know what you were planning." He stopped breathing for a moment. Then I placed a small envelope on the table. Inside was a photograph of the documents he had prepared, along with one sentence written across the top. "I was never broke, Michael. I was testing you." Michael stared at the envelope, and all the confidence disappeared from his face. He slowly picked up the photograph and looked at the documents he thought I would never see. "Dad, I can explain," he whispered. I told him. I had spent my entire life giving him chances to become the man I believed he could be. I reminded him that when he needed help with his business, I had supported him. When his family needed a place to stay, I had opened my home. But the moment he believed I had nothing left, his first thought was my house. Michael lowered his head and said he had only wanted financial security. I asked him if that was why he had already spoken to a buyer and prepared documents to control my finances. He had no answer. Then he admitted that he had believed my health was getting worse and that eventually everything would belong to him anyway. That confession hurt more than I expected. I told him that money had not changed him. It had simply revealed who he had become. He begged me not to tell anyone what he had done. I told him I was not interested in revenge, but I would not allow him to take advantage of me again. Then I handed him one final document. It was a copy of my updated estate plan. His name was no longer included in it. He stared at the page in disbelief and asked, "You are cutting me out?" I looked at him and said, "You cut yourself out the moment you celebrated hearing that I was broke." Michael started crying, but I did not change my decision. I left the restaurant knowing that the test had given me the answer I had been afraid to hear. My son did not love what I had built. He loved what he believed he would inherit. But the next morning, I received a phone call from someone I had never expected to hear from. And what they told me made me question whether Michael had acted alone. The next morning, my phone rang before I had even finished my coffee. The caller was a woman named Susan, someone who had worked with Michael at his business for several years. Her voice was nervous, and she asked if she could speak to me privately. I agreed to meet her that afternoon. When Susan arrived, she looked frightened. She told me that Michael had been talking about my house for months, long before I ever told him I was broke. My heart sank. I asked her what he had said. She explained that Michael had told several people that my house would eventually belong to him and that he was already planning how to sell it. But then she revealed something even worse. Michael had been struggling with serious debts, and he had promised a portion of the money from the house sale to someone else. I asked who. Susan hesitated before handing me a document. It was a private agreement between Michael and a business associate. They had already calculated how much money they expected from my property. I realized the plan had been much bigger than I thought. Michael had not simply wanted my house. He had already promised my house to someone else. I took the document to my attorney, and he immediately said we needed to protect the property before Michael tried anything else. We placed legal restrictions on the title and notified everyone involved that the property was not for sale. Then my attorney contacted Michael and informed him that I was aware of his actions. Michael called me that evening, furious and desperate. He accused me of humiliating him and destroying his future. I told him that he had done that himself. Then he said something that made me realize there was still another secret. "Dad, you do not understand. I needed that money because someone was threatening me." I asked who was threatening him. He went silent. Then he whispered, "The man who helped me plan everything knows where you live." I could hear the fear in Michael's voice, and for the first time, I realized that his greed might not have been the whole story. I asked him who was threatening him, but he refused to say the name over the phone. He begged me to meet him somewhere private. I told him I would only meet him with my attorney present. After several minutes of silence, Michael finally agreed. The next afternoon, we met in my attorney's office. Michael looked exhausted. He admitted that he had borrowed money from a man named Victor several months earlier to keep his business alive. When Michael could not repay the debt, Victor discovered that my house was worth far more than Michael had expected. Victor convinced him that selling my property would solve everything. Michael said he had been told that once I signed the documents, the house could be transferred quickly and the money divided. I asked him why he had told me he wanted to help me. He lowered his head and said, "Because I knew you would never sign if you knew the truth." My attorney asked Michael if Victor had threatened him. Michael nodded. He said Victor had threatened to ruin his business and expose his debts if he did not complete the deal. But that did not excuse what Michael had done to me. He had still chosen to use his own father to solve his problems. Then Michael handed my attorney a phone containing messages between him and Victor. The messages showed that Victor had been planning the property transfer for months. There were also messages discussing my age and health. One message said his father will not fight us. He is old and alone. I felt anger rise inside me. They had mistaken my age for weakness. My attorney immediately contacted the authorities and provided them with the messages and documents. But there was one final message from Victor that frightened all of us. It said, "If the old man refuses to sign, we have another way." The words "we have another way" stayed in my mind all night. I could not sleep because I kept thinking about what Victor might do if he believed I would never sign the papers. My attorney told me not to worry and arranged additional security around my property while the authorities investigated. The next morning, an investigator contacted me and asked me to describe everything Michael had done. I gave them the recordings of our conversations, the documents, the messages from Victor, and the evidence showing that the house had already been promised to another party. Then something unexpected happened. Michael called me and said Victor was coming to my house that evening. He begged me not to tell Victor that he had confessed. I agreed, but only because the investigators wanted to use the situation to catch Victor making another attempt. That evening, I sat in my living room while a recording device captured everything. Around 8 o'clock, a car stopped outside. Victor walked toward my front door with another man. I opened the door before they could knock. Victor smiled and said he had come to discuss my financial situation. I asked him how he knew I was struggling. He said Michael had told him everything. I looked directly at him and said, "Then Michael must have also told you that I am broke." Victor smiled again. "Yes, and that is why I am here to help." I invited him inside and let him believe I was still the frightened old man Michael had described. Victor placed a folder on my table and told me that signing the papers would solve all my problems. I opened the folder and saw the same type of documents Michael had tried to give me. Then Victor leaned closer and said something that made the investigators outside move into position. "Walter, you can sign these papers peacefully, or we can make this much harder for you." I looked at Victor and kept my voice calm. I told him I needed a few minutes to read the papers before signing anything. He became impatient and started threatening me again. He said he knew I had no money and nowhere else to go. I let him continue because every word was being recorded. Then I asked him one question. "Victor, if you are only trying to help me, why did you already promise my house to someone else?" His face changed immediately. He realized I knew far more than he expected. Before he could answer, the front door opened and investigators entered the room. Victor froze. The second man tried to leave, but officers stopped him at the door. Victor was arrested on the spot, and the folder containing the property documents was taken as evidence. Michael was also brought in for questioning because his messages and agreements connected him directly to the plan. When I finally sat alone after everything was over, I felt strangely empty. I had wanted to believe my son was simply making a terrible mistake, but he had chosen to betray my trust for money. Still, I did not want revenge. I wanted my life back. My attorney helped me secure the house, protect my accounts, and update my estate plan. Michael later admitted everything and agreed to cooperate with the investigation against Victor. He told me he had been ashamed and afraid, but knew he had crossed a line he could never erase. I told him forgiveness would not come quickly. If he wanted to rebuild our relationship, he would have to prove through his actions that he had changed. For the first time since this began, I returned to my bedroom and looked at the safe behind the painting. Everything I had built was still there. My money was safe. My house was safe. But I had learned something more valuable than either of them. You can test someone's love by taking away what they think they want from you. And my test had revealed the truth. For the first time in weeks, I felt that I could breathe again. Victor was facing serious charges, and the evidence we had collected showed that the plan to take my house had been carefully organized long before I ever told Michael that I was broke. My attorney helped me make sure the property could never be transferred without my direct approval. He also helped me protect the rest of my finances so no one could use my age or my family connection to gain control over them. Michael came to my house a few days later. He looked completely different. There was no confidence in his face and no talk about money. He simply stood at the door and said, "Dad, I am sorry." I asked him what he was sorry for. He said he was sorry for believing that my money mattered more than my life. He admitted that when I told him I was broke, his first thought was the house and what he could gain from it. He said the word "finally" had revealed what he had been hiding for years. I told him that was exactly why I had tested him. I needed to know whether he loved me or only loved what he thought I would leave behind. Michael began crying and said he understood if I never trusted him again. I told him trust could return one day, but it would not return because of promises. It would return only because of actions. Then I did something he never expected. I gave him a chance to start over, but without access to my money or property. I told him that if he truly wanted to change, he needed to build his own life instead of waiting for mine to end. He agreed. Before he left, he turned around and said, "Dad, I wish I had realized this before." I looked at him and answered, "Sometimes the truth arrives only after someone loses the thing they thought they were guaranteed to inherit." And for the first time, I believed my son might finally understand what I had been trying to teach him all along. The weeks that followed were quieter than anything I had experienced in years. Victor was charged for his part in the scheme, and the evidence from the recordings, messages, and documents made it impossible for him to deny what he had planned. Michael also faced the consequences of his actions and had to accept that the house he had already imagined owning would never belong to him. I did not celebrate his failure because he was still my son. Instead, I hoped that losing my trust would teach him something money never could. I kept my house, protected my savings, and changed my estate plan so that no one could ever assume my future was theirs to control. Months later, Michael came to visit me again. This time he brought no paperwork, no real estate agent, and no questions about my finances. He brought a small box of photographs from my younger years. He sat beside me and said, "Dad, I finally understand why you tested me." I looked at him and asked what he had learned. He said, "I thought your money was my future. I forgot that you were my father." Those words meant more to me than any apology. I told him that I could forgive him, but forgiveness did not mean forgetting. Trust would have to be rebuilt slowly. He nodded and accepted that. That evening, we sat in my garden and talked about things that had nothing to do with money or inheritance. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had my son back. Looking back, telling Michael that I was broke was one of the hardest things I had ever done, but it showed me the truth I needed to know. When I told my son I had nothing left, he thought he had finally won. He never realized that I was testing him. And in the end, I learned something that I wish I had understood much earlier. The people who truly love you will never measure your worth by what you can leave behind.